So, ecocriticism is the study of cultural constructions of nature and environment. It's a new form of literary theory that is in all the up-to-date textbooks of literary theory. And I recommended Beginning Theory by Peter Barry, published by Manchester University Press. And he regularly updates his chapter on ecocriticism as one of the theories that he deals with in the book Beginning Theory, Peter Barry. How have our lifestyles, eco-critics ask, been underpinned by our notions of nature in literature and our assumptions about our environment? And this is my favourite definition of eco-criticism from the American eco-critic Glenn Love, and it's included in the Eco-Criticism Reader edited by Cheryl Gottfelty and Harold Fromm. And he says, why are the activities aboard the Titanic so fascinating? You know the Titanic sank? So fascinating to us that we give no heed to the waters through which we pass. And going up the Nile, I was very much aware of the waters through which we pass. The captain of our ship said, it's much more polluted, this water now, because there are many more cruise ships polluting the water through which we pass. Or to that iceberg on the horizon. You remember the Titanic hit the iceberg on the horizon? So Glenn Love is saying that perhaps literary critics have been so absorbed with theories about language, with social issues, with the quality of the music and who plays the music and who has the power, who pays the musicians on the Titanic, that we have not been paying attention to the waters through which we pass and that iceberg on the horizon. Everywhere I go, I always say, what's your iceberg on the horizon? And quite clearly, I've already said here, the iceberg on the horizon is not millimetre by millimetre sea level rise, but it is metre by metre sea level rise that is coming our way throughout sea-based cities. So, the founding of eco-criticism as a literary movement was marked by the foundation of the Association for Studies in Literature and Environment, ASLE. And you go to the ASLE website, the American organisation ASLE was the first eco-critical organisation, and it was formed in 1995 at a conference in Fort Collins. ASLE's journal is ISLE, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment, which was founded in 1993, just before that conference. And we have a branch of ASLE in the UK, we call it UKI, UK and Ireland. And our journal, founded in the year 2000, is the journal Green Letters. So Green Letters is British eco-criticism, and ISLE is American eco-criticism, and already I've put the editor of ISLE in touch with Magda, and he is open to the idea of having a special issue of ISLE on Egyptian eco-criticism. And he's already been willing to read suggested abstracts for papers that might make a cluster of 3 to 5 papers that represent Egyptian eco-criticism to be published perhaps in ISLE down the line. There are two important pre-eco-critical texts before eco-criticism was invented. In America, in the UK, Raymond Williams' book about the country and the city discussed representations in literature of the countryside and the city and contrasted them. It was very much a Marxist critique of pastoral deceptions, and it resulted in the word pastoral becoming a pejorative term, a negative term. Pastoral was about idealisation. It was about deceptions. It was about ignoring the role of workers. It was about praising the lands of landowners. And that was the function of pastoral literature in the British tradition, argued Raymond Williams in The Country and the City. In the US, Leo Marx, in 1964, wrote a book that's never been out of print, a very influential book in American studies, The Machine in the Garden. And he said, American literature about wilderness and countryside inevitably brings in an interest in technology. At the end of Walden Pond, a railway line went across the end of Walden Pond. There always seems to be a presence of interest in technology in American literature about the garden, about wilderness. It doesn't mean literally cultivated gardens. He means he's taken it from the Garden of Eden, I think, really. He means in the countryside. But very importantly, Leo Marx, and more of this in the second lecture, distinguished sentimental pastoral deceptions from complex pastoral, which he saw as being adaptable and continuing. Okay, I've already mentioned the Ecocriticism reader, which represents American eco-criticism and the American tradition of eco-criticism. And very influential early on was a book called The Environmental Imagination by Lawrence Buell. And in the UK we have the Green Studies reader, which represents a different British tradition of eco-criticism, which emerges out of Romanticism and regarded as one of the founding texts of British eco-criticism, although I didn't know the term eco-criticism when I wrote Green Voices in 1995. It hadn't come across to us that this activity was taking place already in America. But in Green Voices, I looked at the deconstruction of uses of nature by contemporary poets in British literature. So first phase eco-criticism was about wilderness writing. It was about experiences of epiphany, personal change by individuals going out into nature and confronting nature, and it examined those texts with a typical title here, Seeking Awareness Through American Nature Writing in 1992 by Scott Slovic, who is the editor of Isle and who I just said had been in touch with Magda about supporting eco-criticism. And then the second phase of eco-criticism, it splinters in lots of different directions. And it includes ecofeminism. It develops something called toxic discourse. That is fiction and poetry that deals with pollution and toxic environments, environments dangerous to health, for example. It includes urban nature. It includes green cinema. Post-colonial eco-criticism was developed by Graham Huggan and Helen Tiffin. They produced a book of that title, published by Routledge, Post-colonial eco-criticism. I've mentioned biosemiotics, but the second phase of eco-criticism is it's splintering off into these specialist subfields of eco-criticism, which are still ongoing, incidentally. New subfields are being invented every few years. And then the third phase of eco-criticism was when it began to critique itself, and eco-critics criticised other eco-critics. So Dana Phillips, The Truth of Ecology, for example, and Lawrence Buell. I would say this, if you're only going to read one book as an introduction to eco-criticism, that's the one there, Lawrence Buell, The Future of Environmental Criticism. And all of these other books are critical of some aspects of other eco-critics' work. So this is third phase eco-criticism. And as I've said, groups of ASLE, the Association for Studying the Literature and Environment, are now developed in UK, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Europe, and maybe Egypt. And there are other journals, an online journal. These are free online journals. The Journal of Ecocriticism comes from Canada, and Ecozona is the European Journal of Ecocriticism, published out of Spain. And I'm on the board of these journals if you want to have any information about them. Okay, final comments, here it comes. Ecocriticism is not a methodology. It uses all of the previous methodologies. I've been using social constructionism, for example, in my introduction here. Yeah? It uses multiple methodologies. It is not a methodology, it is an approach. It does not displace other theories, but overlays them. So, feminism is overlaid with eco-criticism to become ecofeminism, which looks at the relationship between gender and nature. How are men represented in relation to nature? How are women represented in relation to nature in these texts? Okay? And so it doesn't displace. And what I've been saying to people is, whatever your current areas of interest in literature, you can overlay them with eco-criticism, because nature is everywhere, everything is located in an environment, and there are representations of that environment assumed to be taking place in that text. Yeah? And we've been having some very interesting conversations about people's current areas of research and the way in which they might be overlaid with an environmental awareness that looks at the constructions of environment in the text that people are already interested in. And I'm a great believer in it being developed in relation to where people are at already in their literary traditions and fields. In China, for example, the invention of eco-criticism has been met by philosophers saying Chinese philosophers were doing eco-criticism centuries ago. You know, we just didn't call it eco-criticism, but the study of nature is a very strong tradition in Chinese religion and philosophy. So the Chinese have developed a particular kind of eco-criticism that relates to their own literature. Oh, here we are. What? Oh, I've come to the end. It's the end. The end.
More interesting than the first lecture.
Really?
Different, absolutely different. And
Good.
Inclusive and exclusive, both.
Good.
You have a bird's eye focus and
I think I've probably overrun time for questions.
No, we're fine.
Oh, okay.
You can see
I'm in your hands, okay.
Yeah. The most important thing is that people interact and we benefit from the experience, so we can still stay 10 minutes for questions.
Oh, glad it was better second time round.
thank you very much for a very illuminating lecture. I'm very impressed. Thank you so much. My question is very technical about. Thank you. My question is very technical when it comes to literary theory. You mentioned that ecocriticism is not a methodology. It is an approach. Right. Can you elaborate on that, please, by giving us an example in literary theory as a methodology compared with ecocriticism as an approach?
Yeah.
The difference between methodology and approach.
Sure.
In literary theory and its applications.
Yes. Well, there is such a thing as a Marxist literary theory. Okay, right. So I've already said that this has been explored by Raymond Williams in The City and the Country, and he takes a Marxist literary approach into representations of countryside and environment. So he's particularly concerned with how a tradition of writing about the countryside has been used by people in power to disguise the fact that the work is actually done not by the landowners but by the workers. Where does the farmer appear in literature of the countryside in 18th century British country house poetry, for example? No. There is one example of a literary theory being applied in an pre-eco-critical actually, because eco-criticism wasn't intended to be very precise. But I myself am really interested in theories of deconstruction. And so I've taken a deconstructive approach here and said, let's deconstruct the different ways in which nature could be read in Bob's Lane, for example. Yeah? So, as an ecofeminist, I am writing a series of essays that examine how D.H. Lawrence connects women with nature to critique men in his novels. In novel after novel, the largely central characters are largely male, but the women play a really interesting role in critiquing the men, and often they are closer to nature and bring men closer to nature and each other. They feminize men, in fact, but often it's through a process of contact with nature. So I'm thinking of Lady Chatterley's lover, but the Virgin and the Gypsy was mentioned in questions in the first session. I just looked at the novel Women in Love, and I've looked at one chapter of Women in Love where the central character, Birkin, he is stoning the reflection of the moon in a pond, in a chapter called Mooney in Women in Love by D.H. Lawrence. His girlfriend appears, Ursula, and she pleads with him to stop stoning the moon. The moon in British culture is feminine, and he is very much afraid of forming a relationship with a woman that is going to overwhelm him. And he is cursing the Great Mother. He calls it Syria Dea in the novel, whilst he's stoning the moon. So Lawrence is showing us a man afraid of forming a relationship with a woman and being overwhelmed and dominated by her, okay? At the end of that chapter, Ursula observes some birds and suddenly realizes that the universe, she says, is non-human, thank goodness. And she suddenly takes a very humble position in the universe, realizing that human beings are not at the center of it. She decenters herself in order to connect with nature in a really profound and positive way in just one little moment at the end of that chapter. So what I'm writing about as an ecofeminist reading that chapter is the way in which Lawrence is representing men and women and their tensions through their different relationships and responses to nature. So here is a deconstruction of the imagery of the moon and of birds in my reading of that chapter.
This is an excellent methodology indeed, not merely an approach.
Yes, well, yes. All I'm doing is offering one methodology that I'm using at the moment. If you go to my website, you'll see my current essays of ecofeminist readings of a series of Lawrence novels. I put everything on my website that appears as essays in journals or chapters in books for other people. And by the way, I call them drafts so the publisher doesn't complain that I published the real thing on the web. But of course they're not drafts. Between you and me, I let you into my secret. They are the real thing. Why would I publish drafts? So go to my website if you want to see some examples of practice, of eco-critical practice, and particularly eco-feminist practice perhaps, in relation to D.H. Lawrence. Sorry, long answer.
No, it's okay. can keep this mark
Okay.
with you.
So any other questions, please? The eco-criticism people, Dr. Nadia.
Okay, so Frost's mending walls would be an approach or a methodology. How would you see this? Mending the wall and making these distinct walls between neighbors and so on by using nature. So how would you see this?
Do you know this poem by Robert Frost, Mending Walls? And Robert Frost says, good walls make good neighbours.
Good fences, yes.
You know where you stand if you've got clear demarcations of the land. There aren't arguments about the land. But of course it's also a problem because it's about dualisms, it's about separations.